Hello, everyone. Happy Monday. I'm Michael McNutt with WEDI, and welcome to Maximize Plan ROI on Mandated APIs, Key Considerations for Operationalizing CMS Rule 0057, presented by InterSystems. It's my pleasure to introduce Steve Burko from InterSystems.
The focus of our discussion is up on the screen now. So maximizing plan ROI on mandated APIs, key considerations for operationalizing CMS Rule 0057. And as you've already heard, I brought a couple of colleagues with me today, specifically Jess Jowdy and Mark Munt, and I thought they would be great ads to anchor our conversation. They are both part of our team of field engineers. They both are in leadership positions, but they are up to their elbows every day and actually working with our plan and payer clients now to stand up all the necessary technology to comply with 0057, but very much to do it in such a way that you're not just getting regulatory compliance, but you're supporting larger operational goals. So I think they're going to be able to bring some of those insights from the day-to-day to our conversation today. The next slide just gives you guys a bit of an insight into why Jess, Mark, and I are so passionate about this. As most people know, InterSystems has a pretty big footprint globally in terms of interoperability. But if you just zero in on North America for a second, hopefully everybody knows it's our technology that's supporting the largest EMR in the US, it's supporting the largest QHIN in the US, and also dropping down at the bottom, we're working with a majority of the major payers in the US today, along with a number of Blues, as well as provider-sponsored organizations. But if you go over to the right, I just tried to give people a sense of all the different ways that we're supporting our plan clients today. And if you look at that second bullet point, you can see one of the things we're doing is we're helping them ensure regulatory compliance. But ironically, I don't think it's that bullet why we're so passionate about this subject. It's actually all the other bullets that we want to really ensure that as you put infrastructure in place to support 0057, we believe that the infrastructure that the government is calling to also can fuel advances in a lot of the other big strategic priorities if you think it through in advance. On the next slide, just a little bit of data on why this can prove such a challenge. This is results from a Gartner survey conducted at the beginning of this year. They were talking with a cross-section of plan leaders from 46 different types of plans. And on the left, you can see how those respondents rated what were the most important initiatives to them in the coming year. And kind of moving left to right along the bottom, not too many surprises. So wanting to drive quality, wanting to leverage data and analytics more to improve performance, and so on. What's interesting is if you tweak the question just a little bit and instead ask what are the most important factors in the decision making, what pops to the top is very different. And it is, as I've circled here, it's regulatory shifts. As a matter of fact, it was the only factor that every respondent named as at least somewhat important or very important. And that makes sense in an industry that is as heavily regulated as ours. But again, I think the results that Gartner found frames up both the challenge and the opportunity that we want to talk about today really well, because obviously there are now regulatory mandates out there with compliance deadlines that plans have to meet. So the clock is ticking, if you will, but there's also a huge opportunity to get more than just regulatory compliance. And that's what we really want to talk about today. How can you actually meet the mandates of 0057 while driving larger business aims? So to do so, next slide, we have a 4-point agenda. We want to spend just a little bit of time reminding everybody about kind of the totality of what is 0057. Then we want to go deep on maximizing the ROI, first for the prior auth APIs and then the access APIs. And then we hope to spend some time at the end talking about some of the questions that we're working through, largely the non-technical questions that we're working through to try to ensure that we're doing this in such a way to maximize ROI. So we have a couple of us on the line today. So we are actually going to try to also respond when we're not speaking to your chat questions live. So please don't wait to the bitter end. If you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll try to either get to it live or at the tail end of the phone call today. So itself. Next slide. So I do think it's always very, very important to remember that 0057, it's not a freestanding regulation. It's part of a larger and longer regulatory effort. And on the slide here, I'm just calling out three. So I start on the left with 9115. I assume many people on the phone are familiar with it. And you can really begin to see how 0057 builds on 9115 back in 2020. The government already requiring FHIR-based patient access API and also calling for payer-to-payer data exchange. If you roll forward, now you can start to look at 0057 and you see that with regard to the patient access API, it really is an expansion of what was put in place back in 2020. Payer-to-payer, it's a little bit different. It's more of a swap out. The government recognizing there wasn't really a lot of the desired uptake and coming in with a lot more specificity in terms of, and standardization in terms of how to stand that payer-to-payer API up. And then the last two are really new. So adding provider access API and of course, the prior auth API. I also just want to call out one more, and this is HTI 2P. It's on the far right. And this is an even more recent regulation. Couple of things to note here. Obviously, it is a proposed rule. And with the change in administration, going to have to read the tea leaves a little bit in terms of how soon this might get finalized. There's a lot of bipartisan support for it, but obviously with change, sometimes things slow down. The other thing to call out is that this is actually not promulgated by CMS, but by ASTP ONC, or in more simple language, this regulation is not requiring payers to stand certain things up, but it is in effect expanding the criteria for health IT certification, which is what ONC oversees, or one of the many things they oversee. But I put this here really for that final bullet point on the bottom right, because included in this rule is the requirement that the certification criteria for health IT be expanded. So provider side health IT be expanded to include a parallel set of FHIR-based APIs that in effect would be able to talk with the plan supported APIs that are called for in 0057. And this is something we really, really need to watch, because remember, our focus is on driving ROI. We're going to need utilization, and obviously having a parallel set of FHIR-based APIs on the provider side will help speed things along. All right, let me go ahead and double click on 0057. And this is my effort of kind of reducing the entire regulation, the entire 1,000 pages to one slide, just a 500,000 foot snapshot. Again, a couple of things I want to call out, really four things. One, when you go across the top, it looks like there's three key players, but just keep in mind there's actually four. You've got to double count the other payers, because every plan is sometimes the legacy plan that is required for sharing the information, but equally important, at least every impacted plan, or actually every plan, can also be the recipient, the new plan who is requesting and getting that information. So there's two potential ways that plans can benefit from this regulation. Number two is that prior authorization really is different. I've tried to denote that by referring to the access APIs as data sharing, the first three, and provider authorization as data exchange. And what makes it so much more complicated is you're not just exposing information, you're really trying to automate, in effect, a transaction or a discussion between different parties. So it really is, there is a lot more complicating factors in terms of standing this up. Number three, if you look in each of the blue boxes in the middle, it's not just about standing up the APIs. Of course, there are reporting requirements, but in the regulation, there's lots of conversation about the associated business and operational requirements and workflows. Again, there's a lot that needs to be thought through in advance to get these APIs utilized. And then finally, at the bottom, just a word on what's frequently called the implied fifth requirement. If you read about 0057, you might have bumped into this language that there is actually an implied fifth requirement, and it is the longitudinal health record. And I think to kind of simplify it, why people talk about it that way is if you notice the information flows, it's not just information flowing out, but it's information, clinical information through the prior auth APIs and the payer-to-payer APIs that are flowing to the payer. And so increasingly, payers need, if they're really going to maximize their ROI, not just a data lake, but a true LHR to capture and repurpose this information to get the biggest bang for their buck, if you will. Two more slides just for my general introduction. The next one is the effective dates. Just calling out the two big ones here. With regard to January 1, 2026, I'm going to skip the first row and just focus on the next three. All of these concern prior authorization. So public reporting of prior authorization metrics, how is the plan performing in terms of what's getting through prior authorization, notice to providers of a specific reason for prior authorization denial, conversations going on right now in terms of what code should be used for that, and a new standard or time frame, if you will, for response, not here, but I believe it's 7 days for a standard prior authorization request and 72 hours for an expedited. But I think the big takeaway for everybody on the phone should be, even though the prior authorization API, along with the access API, doesn't have to go live into the very, very outset of 2027, there's going to be a lot more transparency at the outset of 2026 in terms of how plans are performing on prior authorization. Let's move on to January 1, 2027, what everybody's focused on right now, recognizing how much needs to be thought through to stand up the APIs. So that is the go live date in general for both the access and the prior authorization APIs. And I just want to say a quick word about the final element. This is the one that the final column, the affected organization or type, is actually not the payer. It's actually the MIPS eligible providers. And if you're a plan or a payer on the line, I know you might be thinking, wow, there's a lot that I've got to do, and there's a lot we'd like providers to do, but there's not much in the regulation requiring them to do certain things. And again, that's true. That's part of the reason why I think we all need to keep our eyes on HTI too. But I want to just kind of, as best as I understand it, make transparent some of the thinking behind this. So the good news is what the government is saying is that MIPS eligible providers are at least going to have to attest that they used the 0057 API's route for prior authorization at least one time within the year. And that might not seem like a lot, but the purpose, I believe, is just to ensure that providers are trying this. But again, if we're going to get the ROI, we really need to think through how to make that effort, that initial usage, to be positive, because if we want to get broader usage, we're going to have to ensure that it is relatively seamless so it grows and grows. One last slide to go in terms of the setup. These are just three larger framing concepts that I like to remind people to keep top of mind when they're talking about 0057. And they're just things that I've pulled out because I've even found myself in conversations, you get so deep into it that you sometimes lose the forest from the trees. So here's three things to keep that focus on the forest. Number one, don't forget that 0057 pertains to impacted payers. I have listed them out here, but oftentimes I think it's easier to just note who's not included here. And the two big ones are Medicare fee-for-service and commercial. Now, of course, the hope is that these FHIR-based APIs are going to prove so efficient that ultimately all plan products will migrate to them. But at least at the outset, it's impacted payers that are subject to 0057. Two, important to keep top of mind the difference between what is recommended by 0057 and what is required. What is required is the FHIR-based APIs. What is recommended is that those APIs be built out pursuant to a host of Da Vinci implementation guides. I will tell you that we are big proponents of Da Vinci. We are very involved with Da Vinci, and we do think it is the right answer for the industry. However, it is important to keep in mind that these implementation guides are recommended by 0057, not required. And the final one, which in some ways seems to be the most obvious, but even I lose sight of, it is always important to keep in mind that the APIs are not the GUI. They're not, they're not the connection directly between the provider and all this information. These APIs are making the information available. They're exposing the endpoints. So whether it's an EHR or a third-party software or a QHIN, that somebody else can grab that information and make it readily available to the providers. So just three big things to keep in mind before we dive in. All right, with that, let's go to the next slide and talk about, let's get deeper into what it's going to take to maximize the ROI on prior authorization or PA APIs. And even though the regulation talks about a prior authorization API, APIs is very deliberate here. Next slide. Because the regulation actually, again, recommends three different Da Vinci IGs to automate prior auth. And I just gave them here so you have them as a source. They pretty much cover what their titles say. So CRD, coverage requirements discovery, DTR, the documentation templates and rules, and PAS, the prior authorization support, or actually the final exchange to determine whether you have prior authorization. And these three IGs align pretty closely, next slide, with the three principal questions that the APIs are required to answer. And you can see them right in the middle of the screen. So the first one is a PA required? Yes, no. Documentation, what sort of, if yes, and I want to submit a PA, what documentation am I going to need? And hopefully, how do we automate filling in some of that automation? And then finally, the final decision. And to sound a little bit like a broken record, important to remember what is within the scope of 0057 and what is the government hoping that 0057 will enable beyond the scope. Now, what's in the scope of 0057 is really right in the middle of this slide, the plan-supported APIs, right? It is those Da Vinci-based APIs and their ability to go get that information or the answers to those three questions from the health plan systems and expose it to the providers. So you might really want to just mentally draw a dotted box around the middle of this slide. Over on the left, going back to HTI2, it would be helpful if provider side health IT for certification also must support a parallel set of APIs. But, again, we are going to have to figure out how do we, in effect, walk that last mile between the plan-supported APIs and actually the provider portals, whether it's through an EHR, whether it's through a QHIN, whether it's through a third-party app. Obviously, as an organization that supports QHINs and an EMR, we're very, very fixated and neck deep on that as well. But that is not the only opportunity for driving larger business goals. We also have a lot of larger opportunity on the right side. So again, what 0057 requires is that plans kind of transform the information from their back-end systems into Fire-based APIs that are exposed. But at least in our work with plans, a lot of these back-end systems aren't in Fire. And for some plans that we're working with, there's a mix of systems-based and manual. So obviously, there's a lot of opportunities for increasing efficiency through automation, both in terms of how the final answer, in effect, gets transformed into Fire, and also in terms of automating some of the exchange of information to actually answer the questions. So at a very simplistic level, there's if you run along the top to simply answer the question of is a PA required, plans are going to have to first figure out, is the member eligible? They're going to have to figure out what contract do they participate in, and is the CPT actually covered? And then increasingly, what's the provider status, or are they gold carded? Likewise, the clinical rules and utilization review. If they go forward, you're going to have to go through the process. And just, again, a quick note on the LHR, you can start to see why it is a fifth requirement. And that has to do with, with utilization review, plans, automated utilization review, plans are going to start getting more and more clinical information. And it would be great if there was a good place to store it, both to inform prior authorization going forward, and actually maybe even pull forward in terms of contracted coverage. But there's a unique aspect of their clinical situation, which means the request is either covered or not covered. I'm going to actually kind of stop here and turn it over to Mark to dive even deeper into how this is work and the opportunities for maximizing ROI.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. So as Stephen mentioned, there are 3 API requirements for prior authorization under 0057. And really to set the sort of the context for this is really all about, and we could see this in the diagrams earlier and in this diagram. It's really about a negotiation between the provider's EMR system and the APIs hosted by the health plans. And when we talk about whether there's a GUI, the GUI is really happening inside of the provider's EMR. And then everything on the health plan side is happening within the health plan backend systems. So CRD is really the launching point for the entire process, and it's also arguably where you get a lot of front-end value out of it, right? Because what CRD is doing is allowing the clinician to very quickly determine if a prior auth is actually required for the items that they're ordering. And if not, great. They've just saved a lot of back office time, having somebody contact the health plan, find out about the eligibility, find out about the prior auth requirements, and all of those steps, and the sort of burden that rests on the provider, and a corresponding burden on the health plan to answer those requests. So what happens is, as part of the EMR's ordering workflow, now the EMR will make a request out to the CRD API at the health plan, and tell it what is being ordered for this member, along with context about who the member is and what plan they're under and things like that. And then the health plan will check to see if it's an eligible member, see what their contracted coverage is, look at prior auth rules and medical necessity guidelines and things like that. And also look at provider status, which is, there's a lot of talk about gold carding in order to meet the now sort of expedited guidelines for how quickly you need to handle prior auths. That's something that's probably going to be happening a lot more. And so taking all of these things into account, the payer API can say, yes, prior auth is required for this and under this clinician, or no, either no prior auth is required or we just auto approved it basically, and it can just return a response saying everything is fine. You can go ahead with this. And then in the case of when a prior auth is required, it can send some information back, place it in front of the care provider's eyes at the point of care so they can see what's required. And we'll see in a minute that this is also a very powerful opportunities for health plans to get involved at the point of care. And it will display some information to the provider about what requirements there are for a prior auth for whatever is being ordered. So at that point, the provider, if there is a prior auth required, is going to get placed into the DTR process. Next slide, please. Great. And so this is what I was talking about. So this is CRD returns something called a CDS hooks response. And what that does is it includes a set of informational cards, what are called cards. And these cards will be rendered by the EMR and presented to the provider. And at the core of it, this card is telling them that a prior auth is actually required for this, and some form of explanation. But the opportunity that I talked about a minute ago is that because this is happening within the provider's workflow and because it's coming directly from the health plan, health plans have an opportunity at this point to make other suggestions and provide additional information to the provider while they're placing the order. And this can include things like, hey, here are some things that may have better efficacy or similar efficacy with lower cost. Or in the case of the bottom one, it could say, the health plans have, a detailed history of claims, and they could say, hey, clinician, just a heads up, the same member had the same procedure in the past 3 months at this other facility. So the provider can then either say, okay, well, I'll just go and get those test results from that facility, or they can say, no, I know that, but we need to move forward with this, and then they can go ahead and submit their prior auth request anyway. So you can see at the bottom of this card, there's a questionnaire link, and that would be where the provider can now open up a questionnaire, which is provided through the DTR process, which we'll get to in a second, and fill that out and attach it to a prior auth request. So go to the next slide, please. All right, so we've put the DTR and PAS workflows to get together, right? Because the CRD can end, as soon as you find out that a prior auth is not required, or because of gold carding, it's auto approved or something like this. But DTR and PAS work directly together. So I'm actually going to start with PAS for a second here. PAS is the API where a clinician's EMR actually submits a prior auth request. And this is actually kicking off the process where the health plan will adjudicate that request and return a response. All right. So at the point when you're submitting the PAS request, the EMR needs to have put together all of the information that's necessary for the health plan to work on that request. And DTR is what lays the groundwork for that. So DTR is a DTR request would refer to the response from the CRD, and it would request any information in terms of questionnaires or other rules and requirements that are necessary for this. So the EMR will make that request. It'll get a questionnaire response back, and then it can work on populating that questionnaire for inclusion in the prior auth, in the PAS request. And populating that, in the ideal situation, the DTR responses can include what's called CQL code, which would allow the EMR to automatically check the clinical records within the EMR and automatically populate responses. So for instance, you could have a question that boils down to, has this patient tried these other treatments first? Have they had some sort of diagnostic test recently, some particular diagnostic test? So those are things that the EMR can automatically fill in. And then anything that's left over that the EMR is not able to fill in can be displayed directly to the provider so they can offer some sort of response. And then once this questionnaire has been filled out and stored in the EMR, somebody at the provider's organization, it could be the care provider directly themselves, or it could be back office staff, will launch a PAS request through the EMR's prior auth workflow. So they'll launch that request, they'll create that request, they'll submit it to the health plan's PAS API, and then they'll receive a response back. In most cases, that response will probably be pending at first, as the health plan processes it on the back end. But again, here's another opportunity for the health plan to respond quickly if they have all the information required, and just they could approve it right away if that's possible. And then for pending responses, the EMR can subscribe to updates to that request. And then the EMR would get notified when there's a change to the status of that PAS request. Okay, next slide.
Let's go back to that slide for a sec.
Okay, sorry.
So it's pretty easy to see how this can start to feel, very, very overwhelming. I'm just picking up on a conversation that's going on in the chat in terms of what's the right portal for kicking this all off on the provider side, and then increasingly the recognition that there needs to be an API broker between kind of these APIs and the plan systems, because most plans that we're working with, the is not done by any monolithic system. You've got the proprietary rules, you've got the rules here, the license rules, you've got the delegated vendors. So there has to be a determination of when that when that prior authorization request comes in, where does it get directed to? I'll also tell you that I've been engaged recently with a number of conversations with individual plans talking about, well, wait a minute, a lot of our medical policies, they're not in machine readable language. Stephen, how am I going to kind of automate this to maximize my ROI? And so there's a lot of things to consider here. I think the good news is that you can stage the effort. And I think this gets us to the next slide. So just two things to keep in mind as, whether you're a plan or you're somebody who's working with a plan in terms of how do you maximize the ROI. One, don't lose sight of what's required versus what's desired. So obviously it would be great if all the medical policies had been reduced to machine readable language. But what I'm seeing time and again, you can isolate a subset of things that are easier to reduce or have already been reduced to machine readable language and start there. The stuff that is commonly requested and more easily adjudicated, and you can begin to see a big return. But again, that's desired. What is required is that that it be transformed into a Firebase API that can be picked up on the provider side. The other thing I want to keep in mind, though, is what do we need right now? What is going to get providers to start migrating towards this system? And I want to go back just mentally, not actually to that first slide with the big stop sign. And just remember that a huge percentage of of requests for PAs are submitted for which no PA is required. So even if we could check off just that first box, we would probably see a large ROI, both reductions in provider abrasions, providers knowing right up front, wait, you don't even need a PA for this, and huge efficiency gains for the plan, because you don't have to go through all the work of adjudicating a PA that should have never or didn't need to be submitted. So you might want to sit down with your providers at some point and not necessarily fill this out, but just use this as a discussion piece to think about what do we want to pull forward, and how many of these, how do we want to stage our effort to maximize our ROI. All right, let's go on to the next section. Okay, we're switching over to the Access APIs. And I just want to start off with the data requirements really quickly, reground everybody. Next slide. So there is some good news here, and that is 0057 really builds upon 9115 with regard to the data requirements. I've tried to suggest this on the far left with regard to the patient access API. In that first box at the top left, those data requirements are basically the data requirements that plans already have to have up and running under 9115. And in effect, 0057 expands upon that. If you drop down to the bottom, the big add is prior authorization. And then moving right, you can begin to see this repeats with regard to the other two access APIs. The regulation does not start from square one. In effect, what it says is, now let's start with what we're requiring from the patient access for the patient access API, and let's make some logical additions and subtractions. I think the one nice subtraction on the payer-to-payer side is a recognition that we don't have to do 17 years worth of data. We can cut this off at 5 years. But in general, I'll leave this for your later review. I think what the regulation calls for is pretty logical. Instead, I want to use our time or the next few minutes to focus on that payer-to-payer API, because at least what we believe is that there is a huge opportunity with the payer-to-payer API for driving value-based care. And this is the next slide. The why is on the left, and it hasn't changed. I mean, the aspiration when 9115 came online, it's still there. It's in that box on the left. We have a huge amount of churn among payers, or members moving among payers, or even to being uninsured and then back to being insured. And all too often, amidst that churn, a lot of information is lost. But the opportunity is even better, because if we could close that information gap at the front end, which is what the second quote goes to here, a huge opportunity to have more consistent care. To not have people kind of losing important medications and other therapies for chronic illnesses or whatnot. It is such a critical time, and the payer-to-payer API puts in place the infrastructure needed to actually close that gap. So that begs the question, all right, if the need was already always there, what's different? Why aren't we just going to have a repeat of 9115, a call for the payer-to-payer that doesn't materialize the way we would hope? And I think the answer is there's a lot more specificity. And I've tried to call this out in the box on the right. So second bullet point, now specifying it has to be a FHIR-based API, strongly recommending a DaVinci ID, the PDEX, for how this API is going to work, and then dropping down to the bottom, expanding this to also include FHIR bulk data access. And this is particularly important for this access API, because the biggest amount of churn happens during open season, and to do it one-off is not realistic. So if you have bulk data access, you can actually capture all the change that happens during open season. But again, to get these APIs to work, it's not just about standing up the API. There's a lot of operational considerations. And this time I'm going to hand it over to Jess to talk about some of the things she's working through with the customers she's dealing with every day.
Hi, everyone. I'll keep my time short just so we have time to address all of the questions that are coming in through the chat, which is fantastic to see. But let's talk a little bit about that payer-to-payer API. First item just to discuss is it's an opt-in process. So members have to opt in order to do the data sharing from the payer-to-payer perspective. As part of this kind of opt-in process, there needs to be educational material describing to the member kind of the benefits of this opt-in or the benefits of opting into this data sharing process. The other piece to this, and we'll talk about the other piece of the member opt-in process is, health plans just have to have a method of capturing that consent. A lot of folks are looking towards leveraging their member portals to retrieve this information from the members and provide that educational content there as well. Second item on this slide here talks about identification of previous and current concurrent payers. In order to enable the payer-to-payer data sharing, the member needs to provide their previous or concurrent coverage information to the current health plan to aid in that member match process. So similarly to the capture of consent, a lot of folks are turning towards the member portal to be able to acquire this information. But this coverage information is required to be able to have a successful member match from the prior health plan or the concurrent health plan that has to respond to the payer-to-payer request coming from your organization. So it needs to be methods of capturing that concurrent information, or that coverage information, I should say. And then as far as the information updates, a couple of notes on this beyond the bullets on the screen. I think there's an opportunity to look at the best practice strategies for leveraging this payer-to-payer API as the either new or concurrent health plan requesting information from another payer. So as Stephen mentioned, there is both individual and bulk options for being able to retrieve member information as part of the payer-to-payer plan. So thinking about things like scheduling those requests, if it's a concurrent payer, doing it on a quarterly basis, for instance. But when we talk about, doing bulk loads, being able to almost like group your members based on prior health plans would allow you to be able to make less calls to be able to retrieve the same amount of information, leveraging bulk fire. So not only are we thinking about, how often we're pulling that information, but like, what's the best strategy for being able to kind of pull that information together? The other piece, when we retrieve information as part of the payer-to-payer API, it does become part of the member record within that health plan. So what that means is if there's another access API that requests information about that member, whether it's the provider access, the patient access API, or down the road that member switches to another health plan and a health plan requests that information, it is on the health plan to supply not only the information that originated from the health plan as part of that API, but also any information collected about that member from other sources, for instance, other health plans as part of the payer-to-payer exchange. So as Stephen mentioned, this kind of concept of a longitudinal record is kind of hidden within this regulation, but being able to not only be able to acquire this information, but to store it in a way that makes it accessible for the other access APIs to leverage is critical for a long-term compliance with the regulation. And my second slide here is talking a little bit more about the provider access API. So as kind of Stephen mentioned, the 9115 regulation really created the foundation for both the provider access and the payer-to-payer API. So there are some differences in the data that should be shared, but the foundational pieces of it are similar. So it really builds upon that framework. Difference with provider access as it versus the payer-to-payer. One, it is an opt-out model, so there still needs to be a method of enabling members to be able to opt out of data sharing, but it's a little bit different than the payer-to-payer, which is an opt-in approach. The other piece of the provider access API that's probably the most interesting for health plans to work with is this concept of a treatment relationship. So if a provider requests information from a member, first thing, as this kind of Venn diagram, if you will, is showing, is whether or not that disclosure is permitted by law. Second aspect of this is whether or not that patient has opted out. So we talked about the member portal capturing that kind of information. The third aspect of this is whether or not that provider has a treatment relationship with the member. And this definition of treatment relationship isn't well defined within the rule, but there are different ways that the health plans are capturing these relationships between providers and members. There are some strategies around it, but essentially, in order for that information to be shared, there needs to be a verification that that provider has a treatment relationship. And only in those three scenarios that it can be disclosed by law that the patient has not opted out and that there's a treatment relationship in place, can that information actually be shared through the provider access API. And just really quick, just in the interest of time, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but we did mention that there is an educational requirement for the provider access standpoint. There is an educational requirement for both the members and the providers. So for the members, explaining the process, the opt-out process, and explaining the value of being part of this data sharing process. And providers, they really just need that kind of plain English plain language, I should say, understanding of how the Access API works, how the relationship and treatment relationships work, and so on. So we won't go into too much on that, but that is part of this requirement as well.
So this slide just brings us back to that fifth implied requirement around the LHR, the longitudinal health record. And we keep talking about, wow, if you have a robust LHR, well, what does it mean? Well, it's all the stuff that I think we hope, dream, and aspire to in terms of really driving value-based care. That if we truly have a record that is, it says, longitudinal and comprehensive, that will really be able to support some things. And we're already working with some clients doing this, but just keep in mind, what is the difference between a true LHR and a data mart or a data lake? And I think the real divider is the data that's going in there harmonized, normalized, and deduplicated, so you can repurpose it for all these other kind of higher value ends. I mean, one of the things we've heard time and again from providers is they're just like patients, that they will be more willing to share clinical data if they feel that it will be curated appropriately, so that plans don't have to ask for the same piece of data for each application individually. Get it once, use it multiple. If it is a responsible utilization, providers telling us that they will be more willing to be a partner in that exchange. All right. Hopefully, to preserve a few minutes for questions, let's go to the next section. And if you go to the next slide, we've just been increasingly, it's just a listing of literally the non-technical questions. If this was a listing of the technical questions, as Justin Mark would tell you, it would be a lot longer. But we tried to just create a list of non-technical questions that we're working health plans through to really maximize the ROI. We've had 2 pieces of feedback. I'll share them with you. Wow, this list is still really long. So I tried to kind of do, the most important of the most important. We tried to highlight them here. But, oh, and by the way, the source there, we've written up a lot of the stuff in a white paper that's publicly available. You can see the link down below. You can find it on our website. But if you go to the final slide, what this does is resequence those top 10 questions. So instead of doing it by API, it's really by operational consideration. And, we got a lot of, when we put it out there by APIs, we're almost reinforcing silos that we want to knock down. So I think this is the pushback we got. I think it was good pushback in that if you're really thinking through those non-technical key considerations, first think through what is the infrastructure I have in place, not just the IT infrastructure, but also the organizational infrastructure. You can see that captured in number 1, especially with regard to prior authorization. We repeatedly recognize that 0057 was forcing and interoperability teams to come together and work together in a much closer way than ever before. And a lot of the needed kind of organizational meetings and whatnot, they didn't exist. 2, once you figure out what's my infrastructure, what are the operational processes that are going to have to change? 4 through 7 largely kind of encapsulate the questions that just walk you through. And then finally, don't forget to think about end user deployment. Ultimately, if we're really going to maximize the ROI, kind of this FHIR-based APIs are going to have to be utilized. We've talked a good bit today about, getting providers to kind of use them, but it's not just providers. So remember, with regard to payer-to-payer, if we're really going to get end user deployment, plans have to be thinking about how their own case managers are going to take advantage of the information, in effect, you will now be able to ingest from the legacy plan. And I'll just one final note, we've heard time and again, right answer is not to decide how this should work for the interoperability team, but right answer is to figure out how these workflows work right now, what's needed, and to be ensure that the APIs support them. We have a few minutes for questions. Michael, if you want to call out a few.
Sure thing. There's and continue folks to ask questions in the chat. Stephen, what accounts for the silos you're encountering between plan interoperability teams and their peers?
That's a great question. I'm curious if other people want to chime in. As best as we can discern, it's not like there's some monolithic reason why it's been there. It's just that there hasn't been kind of sort of a catalyst or an impetus for these teams to work more closely together. So the good news is that when teams recognize this, there's no natural pushback against trying to put in place standing meetings and whatnot. It just needs to be done. But we're finding it's a little bit like riding a wave. Once people recognize it's there, going up the top side of the wave, the back side of the wave is pretty easy sailing.
So we have a question in the chat. Will the receiving payer have to account for cleaning the data from the legacy payer prior to loading?
Yes. I don't know, Jess or Mark, if you want to chime in there, but that gets back into what I'm talking about, that I think payers need to really start thinking about what is the difference between, just kind of what I would call a kitchen sink CDR, a data mark, or a data lake, and a truly robust LHR, that the receiving payer is going to be responsible for harmonizing, normalizing, deduplicating the data, so it can be put to good use.
Yeah, I would say, just to add to that, in theory, these health plans should be conforming to the standard, the USCDI standard, the Care and Blue Button standard. So the hope, right, is that these health plans, the data that's coming from these other health plans, meets that criteria for what I would call clean data. Now, as Stephen mentioned, the harmonization of that information. So let's just say, from like a clinical data perspective, reconciling, medication lists or allergies or things like that, that would be something that the health plan would have to take on to be able to create that kind of clean longitudinal record. But you do have that I don't want to say safety net, but the thought that all of those other health plans do have to conform to the same formats and standards that you have to conform to as well.
Yeah, I mean, the big hope is that at least with FHIR, that we can get these information as elements as opposed to kind of locked in larger documents that have to be parsed.
Excellent, Thank you. One more question. How much of the code and infrastructure put in place for 9115 compliance can be leveraged for 0057?
Yeah.
Mark, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, so, different parts of 0057 have different requirements for, obviously, for access to the LHR. But yeah, I mean, a lot of infrastructure can be leveraged for that, right? Because a lot of this is about having that complete clinical view of the member, and being able to fetch that data so that you can send it out for payer-to-payer responses, respond to patient access and provider access requests. And so, health plans have already had to deal with that in order to adhere to 9115. So, the hope is that those 9115 solutions can be upgraded to handle the new requirements, including the metrics, and also, presenting prior auth records. if they are able to be upgraded for that, then that, you could certainly reuse that in infrastructure. And for our part, when we've been designing our solution for 0057, one of our goals has been to work as much as possible with existing infrastructure that the health plans have set up, so they don't have to rip and replace, and that they can work with the best of breed solutions that they've chosen for all of the various, business functions.
Sounds good. Thanks. Charles on the chat has a question. Does the regulation require the incoming payer data normalization in order to respond via the patient access API, or can normalization for effective use operationally?
Yeah, I was in the middle of typing. I was trying to get that before. But from my understanding, there's no regulatory requirement to do that harmonization or that normalization. And the key is being able to respond to the appropriate information given the member's information that's being requested. So I'd say, as Stephen was talking about, going beyond just, checking a box for the regulation and actually, making use and innovation, driving in innovation and initiatives off of this information that you're collecting. That's really where like the normalization piece comes in. But at least at this point in time, my understanding, there's no regulatory requirement to, for instance, harmonize or deduplicate information that's coming from those sources, just to expose the appropriate information that you're maintaining for that member.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, one last question. Are there best practices plans should consider for bolstering provider utilization of FHIR-based prior authorization APIs?
That's a really good question. And again, I really encourage people to not think about this in a binary fashion. Ironically, I was talking with somebody on the EMR side about this. And again, we were talking about, prior auth and how do we actually get providers to embrace what should be a win-win for everyone if we can get this kind of rocking and rolling. And I think we have to just not lose sight of some kind of basic truisms when it comes to change management. Ultimately, the people who are going to get providers to want to switch to this route are providers. It's not going to be exogenous. Even the way the regulations, it is encouraging, it is not mandating. So when you're thinking about this, and whether you're a plan or you're working with plans, I encourage you to really think about who are the provider champions, to actually really think about what are the subset of providers who are most already wired towards moving to this approach, whose opinions carry weight with their peers. So in other words, stop trying to convince everybody at once, convince the critical few providers in your network and trust them to bring other people along. And I just don't lose sight of basic tenets of change management as we move forward.
Excellent. Thank you. Stephen, Jessica, Mark, fantastic presentation today. Thank you very much. And thank you so much to InterSystems for sponsoring this event.